In today's weather, heading into a difficult and troubling forecast, as one of the big disasters of 2024 is about to unfold. Helene, a Category 3 hurricane, about to slam into Florida in the next few hours, with enhancement of damage due to the very large structure of the storm and the rapid inland movement. Welcome to another edition of Forecast Lab. We're going to cover all of the products with a more technical slant than you might find elsewhere on the internet. And I've got the latest mesoscale data for Hurricane Helene. At the current time, the storm had sustained winds of 125 miles an hour. That makes it an upper-end Category 3 storm, pressure 951 millibars. Why do we talk about pressure? Well, a good rule of thumb is to use the 900 to 1,000 range. The very bottom of the 900s is what you might see with epic hurricanes like Camille and Katrina. The top end is what we see with tropical depressions. So you just look at where you are in the 900s. That gives you a good idea what's going on. At least 5 Atlantic hurricanes have gone into the 800s. Wilma, Gilbert, the 1935 Labor Day storm, Rita, and Allen. Let's look at the forecast movement. This is from the high-resolution rapid refresh. This is not really geared for hurricanes. It's borrowing data from some of the other models to come up with this, but it gives us a good ballpark, and we know that this is pretty consistent with the global models. And this takes it into the Eastern Bay, the National Hurricane Center, going for the central part of Appalachia Bay, maybe a little bit of a shift into the east part. So they're kind of converging in this general area. This is going to be 11 p.m. That's when this model is expecting landfall. You can see already some of these spiral bands working pretty far inland. Now, the wind field here, I would not take that literally. It may be stronger than this. The models are pretty hit and miss with the actual winds at the surface. So what's more important here is the pattern. Here's a plot that shows strictly the wind field. You can see that's heading right into Appalachia Bay there this evening after dark and coming inland around 11 or 12. It's always good to put this into context with the hemispheric and synoptic scale picture. We see Helene out there in the eastern Gulf, a couple fronts starting to come together. Anytime you're in a convergent circulation, that is an area that is prone to frontogenesis, and we've got some of that going on, and this will convert over into an extratropical system over the next 1 to 2 days. In the northwestern U.S., we've got a fresh outbreak of cold air coming in from western Canada and the Pacific, and a very strong system off of British Columbia. This is the remnants of Typhoon Pulasan. They've got rainfall and wind warnings all up and down the coast, so this will definitely have some effects there in British Columbia. Just a quick look up in Alaska, not much going on. They are expecting a major storm system around Monday or Tuesday next week that will have hurricane-force winds. Haven't looked at the impacts on southeastern Alaska, but if you're heading out to that area, you definitely want to check the forecasts. Northern Arctic regions looking pretty good. The effects of some warm air advection bringing the temperatures up near 40 degrees. And when you go to Churchill, that's the polar bear capital of Canada, they're up to 73 degrees this afternoon. Very intense warm advection bringing 80s all the way up to Gillam, Manitoba. And we return down south. The only other feature of note is this blob of cold air, noted by the concentric appearance of those dashed red lines. Those are thickness contours. This indicates a chunk of colder air across the boot heel of Missouri and parts of the Mississippi River Valley. If we go to the pivotal weather 700 millibar temperature, you can see that pocket of cold air right there below freezing at 700 millibars. We bring up a skew T, and you can see that the atmosphere is almost dry adiabatic from the surface up to about 15,000 feet. So this is a ripe area for shallow convection. Here's a look at it with our own charts, 700 millibars, showing that pocket of cold air across northeastern Arkansas. And that cold air is basically going to wrap into the back of Helene, and it goes through the process of occlusion as we go into the weekend. That wraps fully up, and the main baroclinic zone remains out to the east. So this is going to start behaving somewhat like a cutoff low or an occlusion. Both of those are cold core quasi-barotropic systems. This may be a little bit hard to read. This is some old training material. This shows the structure of one of those systems. In the case of a cutoff low off California, the vorticity field concentrated right there in the middle of the low. It is vertically stacked. This is a cross-section showing the height, and the thickness patterns are concentric near the center as well. Very little advection around the surface low. And really, that goes for everything, the upper levels, the mid-levels, the thickness, the vorticity. And you can indeed see that right here, very little vorticity advection, but it is concentrated right there in the center, co-located with the colder air. And there it is. There's Helene starting to show up. We see the low-level circulation, which extends quite deep through the troposphere. So even at 500 millibars, it is rotating cyclonically. We have to go way up to the top of the troposphere to find the anticyclonic outflow. And you can see a little Fujiwara effect take place here going into tomorrow as both of those converge. And as they pile together, that's where you get the occlusion process. And that becomes decoupled from the main baroclinic zone, the main jet off to the east. And we call it a cutoff low because it is cut off from the warmer air and the temperature contrasts. So that will decay going into early next week and gradually get picked up by the prevailing westerlies. Starting with this trough here, the approach of a trough to a cutoff low. You might have heard that rule before. I think that's Henry's rule, if I'm not mistaken, as that approaches the cutoff low that picks it up. And indeed, that's what we see right here. And we get back into some very progressive westerlies. And there, yeah, there's a cutoff low right there off of California. Where'd that come from? That appears to have been drifting out in the Pacific for a while. But anyway, that's going to sit off of California for a good week or so. And then it gradually gets picked up by this trough and a more classic Henry's rule application there. Anyway, let's get back to our hurricane. We start to look at some of the radar data, and it's coming within range of two of the radars, Tallahassee and Tampa. You can definitely see the eye there. That's going to be about 100 miles away from the radar site. These outer spiral bands are already producing some severe weather. The environment here is highly sheared in the vertical. So we've got one supercell here near Punta Gorda that is lifting rapidly to the north. And we have another tornado warning for Lakeland. If we look at the actual warning text, we see that this storm is moving north at 60 miles an hour. This is the echo tops. The cyan colors are going to be tops of around 20,000 to 30,000 feet. Let me put the scale on there so you can check that out. Way over there on the left. And this is showing a couple of interesting things. We see the higher tops with the more powerful outer spiral band convection. There's another one right there near Orlando. And if we look at the eye, we see the very high tops near the eye wall. So those are going to be some very impressive convective elements near the max range of the radar. This is in excess of 50,000 feet. Now, one thing about the hurricane coverage that you see on TV and on the internet, they don't really do a good job distinguishing between the different channels that we get from the GOES imagery. This right here you're probably more familiar with. This is the infrared imagery, and we see the colder tops in black. That's going to be the highest cloud tops that pretty much correlates with what we see on radar. We also get the visible imagery only during the day, but that's very good for picking out the eye. You can definitely see where that is, and especially later during the afternoon as we get the cloud shadowing, it becomes more apparent, such as what you see right here. We also see the overshooting tops right there with the higher convective elements and some gravity waves extending out from that. So very neat things to look at, and also the areas in between the spiral bands, the alleyways, you can see those as well. But the infrared imagery probably a little more useful for that. You can see the warmer tops in between. Water vapor imagery, that can be useful as well, although it is attenuated by a lot of the mid and high-level clouds. A very great system is the GOES GLM Mapper. This is an optical detection system on the satellites. Before 2017, we did not have this. We had to use electromagnetic triangulation, and those systems costed money to subscribe to. So this is a definite improvement, and it gives us better coverage out over the oceans. The coloring is according to how recent the strikes are, and you can see it's kind of coming and going around that eye wall. Same thing with the outer spiral bands, and one particularly strong storm, very persistent, off of Cape Kennedy right there. Now that I think about that, I think that is probably Cape Canaveral, one of the two. I think Cape Kennedy might be the Space Center, but in any case, you get the idea. We've got the latest track from the National Hurricane Center right here. It's a little bit blocky. This is actually a spline, so we have to not follow this literally, but some correction is called for. So we only get those points every 6 hours. So basically, National Hurricane Center looking for landfall in the central part of Appalachia Bay. For the center of the circulation, that means this area right here, Fish Creek, Steinhatchee, and that other town right there. Where is it? Forgot the name. Perry. Yeah, they're going to be getting the full brunt of that eye wall. This purple line right here, that's the deterministic GFS. If we correct that for storm motion, the most recent storm motion, we get something like that, that purple line. So that is the interpolated GFS track. There is the European model in yellow. There's the European ensemble mean, and we do get one from the GFS as well. That's going to be this purple line, and the NHC track following that very closely. The Hurricane Analysis and Forecasting System, one of the more robust models, just added those. That's one right there. That's the other, so they're taking that a little bit further to the east. The Variable Track Consensus models, we add those in. That pretty much blends together all of the best models, and they're pretty much right there in the central part of Appalachia Bay near the NHC track. A couple of models that I occasionally look at are the trajectory and beta advection models. Those are actually pretty good, although in this case, the deep layer model right there and the mid-layer model going a little bit further to the east. Again, that is a trajectory model. It does not really model the dynamics of the storm. Kind of looks at the large-scale flow, but it does tend to have pretty good results. They have had a few failures over the years, like Hurricane Laura, but this has leaned east for the past few runs, and I noticed that the NHC track has also kind of followed it east, so there may be some value in keeping tabs with that particular index. And let's just look at the neural network model. I don't know much about that, but yeah, there's one. The other is buried underneath that. So those are going to be some of the better models, and it looks like the center of the circulation right there in Appalachia Bay. Thankfully, the coast right here is fairly sparsely populated, but the elevations there. Yeah, let's take a look at Steinhatchee here. The elevations in that town only run from about 5 feet to 15 feet above sea level. The storm surge expected to be 16 to 20 feet through that area, so this is certainly going to be devastating. If you're anywhere on the coast there around Appalachia Bay or just outside of it, this is not a situation where you should try writing things out. The evacuation warnings are especially urgent. Even Tampa looking for a 5 to 8 foot storm surge, 10 to 15 feet near Cedar Key, so you need to be out of there for sure. Here's a quick look at the wind field from this morning's GFS run. This storm moves inland, steamrolls across Georgia. That's 1 a.m. And by 7 a.m. moving into the Piedmont region and the Blue Ridge Mountains. There could be some very severe effects through there. The NHC track, of course, was a little bit further to the west. Of course, I've thrown everything on here, so it's very hard to see what's happening. But let me see if I can get the NHC track flashing. The official track. There it is right there. So it's got it going right across Tifton, Atlanta, right up I-75, and into eastern Tennessee. So this does differ a little bit from the GFS run, which goes further to the east. So some correction of this wind field may be called for. And that tells me the mountains of extreme northeastern Georgia will be particularly heavily hit. And you got the combination of orographic lift, the high precipitable water, 2.5 to 3 inches. That means high precipitation efficiencies. All of that combines into a very high flash flood risk, looking at over 10 inches of rain in many of those mountainous regions. And you can see the Weather Prediction Center's concern. They've got a high risk of excessive precipitation all the way from Tallahassee up I-75 to Atlanta and into the Blue Ridge Mountains. There's the extent of all the watches and warnings. Definitely a bad night for Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, parts of North Carolina. Just to break this down, the hurricane warnings follow this line right here. Those go as far west as Calhoun County, Florida, Dothan, Alabama, well inland into Columbus, Georgia, Barnesville, Forsyth, Georgia, Macon, Georgia, all of that under hurricane warnings. Eastman, Douglas, Fargo in South Georgia, and Albany and Valdosta, Tifton, all of that in the hurricane warning. Around that, we've got tropical storm warnings as far west as Freeport, Florida, all the way up into far eastern Alabama. Let me shift this around so you can check it out. Covering all of the remainder of Georgia into the Blue Ridge Mountains. This corner of North Carolina into Charlotte, that's under a tropical storm warning, and that goes all the way down the coast to Myrtle Beach. As far as the storm surge, just to give you some more information on that, the entire area from here to here, I think it stops about right there somewhere. That's the 16 to 20 foot storm surge region. Then as you go down the coast, you're looking at about 10 to 15 feet, and then 5 to 8 as you get into the Tampa area. And then, of course, all the way from North Carolina down into Florida, we do have a risk for hurricane-generated tornadoes, a highly sheared environment in that warm sector to the east of the storm. Okay, it's time to take a look at the forecast, and I've got the fronts drawn on here. This is GFS data with thickness, and I've got the fronts added by hand, so some very useful information. We start out with tonight's map. We've got the hurricane starting to make landfall. This is 7 p.m. Central Time. The Pacific front moving into the Dakotas and into Wyoming. They've had red flag warnings through that area due to the strong gusty winds and the very low relative humidities. As we go into tomorrow, hurricane makes landfall overnight. It'll be a very rough night. And of course, the NHC track going further west on this storm. So anywhere in Georgia up to the western counties of South Carolina and northward, those are going to be very problematic areas, some extreme rainfall, and of course the wind field, which will penetrate very far inland. And some areas into Georgia, it may resemble a derecho. The high forward speed of that storm will carry the momentum of that wind field far inland. Remember, hurricanes, they dissipate inland due to a combination of friction, but also the loss of latent heat. All of that takes many hours, kind of like when you unplug a fan and for a moment there's still a lot of spin in there. That's what's going on, so we're going to see the effects of a landfalling hurricane extending hundreds of miles inland. This is a region of pine forest through here. The trees tend to snap really easy. I know that because we used to have property on a pine forest lot, and those trees were constantly snapping. So we're going to see probably enormous damage to the power grid, likely in the last few miles of distribution to the customers. So you need to make sure that you're prepared to be without power for weeks if you're in that hurricane warning area. Utility crews will be completely swamped well into October due to the enormous scale of that damaged swath. As those high winds surge inland over that rough terrain, we're going to see shedding of that momentum in the form of eddies. As frictional effects begin changing the storm, that means localized high gusts, not just a flat wind field of high winds, but actual areas where there's almost like gustnadoes that tear through and a few brief tornadoes. So it's especially important to follow the latest warnings from the Weather Service and be ready to take shelter quickly if you hear something coming your way. And there should be extensive damage up the I-75 corridor into Macon and into Atlanta possibly. On another note, I'm impressed by how well these dynamical models have been doing. We've seen great consistency with a very difficult storm scenario. I think a lot of credit goes to NHC, AOML, Florida State University. A lot of organizations have built these systems up over the years. And of course, the global models from NCEP, the National Meteorological Center, the newer version of that. A lot of that work has gone back 50 years, and we're definitely reaping the results of that. So we've had pretty good accuracy on the landfall in the past 5 days. You remember we were talking about this last week, looming in the Gulf. Anyway, let me get back on track. This is going to be tomorrow afternoon. We get that occlusion taking place, a lot of rain into the Ohio River Valley, dry slot working into the south side right there across Alabama and Georgia that will shut down the rainfall and provide a little bit more pleasant air mass. You can see that concentric bullseye right there indicating the cooler air wrapping south of that low. Elsewhere, continuation of heat in the southwest. Phoenix expected to get up to 113, Tucson 105 for tomorrow, but it will be getting worse over the weekend. A major cool down in South Dakota, highs only in the 80s. They're going to be back in the 90s on Saturday. And we take this forward. This low stalls out in the Ohio River Valley. We get up to the afternoon, that low just sitting there around Louisville. We're looking for 115 at Phoenix on Saturday, 113 at Needles, 112 at Yuma. And that will last for at least another few days. We go into the remainder of the period. Monday, here comes a new front barreling south. Highs in the 50s and 60s up there in Montana and North Dakota. Our system finally starts moving out on Tuesday. Meanwhile, cold air advection into the northern plains. And we get into a very La Nina type pattern, actually. Warm in the southwest, cool up north, and very frequent Alberta clippers. All of that very common in these La Nina years. So this is a bit of a taste of what's coming in November and December, although the pattern's not going to be like that all the time. So there's one front right there for Saturday next weekend, about 8 or 9 days from now, and here comes another one coming in from the Pacific. So looks like summer is over for everywhere east of the Cap Rock, east of the Great Plains, but still remaining quite warm in the southwest part of the country. So one last look at our hurricane before we wrap things up and get this uploaded. It is starting to move into the Appalachia Bay area, so we're just a few hours away from landfall. Probably sometime around 10 o'clock, I would guess. I'm just ballparking here. I've been looking at so much data. But in any case, it is on the way. And from the looks of this, it appears to be moving just about due north, maybe a shade to the east. So I think NHC has got this pretty much nailed. A couple tornado warnings continue in the outer spiral band, so if you're out there in central or northern Florida, you need to keep track of what's going on. And I almost forgot the surface data. This is also very important. Not going to see a whole lot just now because the storm is offshore. Most of the strongest winds are very close to the eye wall. However, looking at the wind field across the Florida peninsula, these are in knots, not miles an hour. To convert to miles an hour, you need to multiply times 1.15. So it's kind of like figuring a tip, adding that 15%. So looking at gusts up to about 30 to 40 knots across the interior as you get out towards Tampa. The current winds are running about 20 gusting to 40 knots. So that's going to be about 46 miles an hour for gusts. The strongest winds near that eye wall. We don't have too many stations on the coast. We'll probably get some data from this station right here until they go offline. Usually communications gets knocked out. And in the western periphery, we're getting gusts up to 35 at this time. So not much to see at this moment, but those winds will be picking up over the next few hours very quickly. And that will do it for this episode. Hopefully I covered everything. If there's anything I forgot, or if you want to add some details, if you're in the Southeast and you're seeing interesting stuff going on, please leave a comment. I'm sure all of us would appreciate that. Also, please consider our Patreon. There's the link for that. You can help keep this program going if you're enjoying it and getting information from it. Also, you can go to weathergraphics.com and pick up one of my books where I condense a lot of this detail into book form. And hopefully you can learn from that and pick up some good information as well. Okay, hope you have a great rest of your Thursday. Have a great weekend, and we'll be back on Monday for the private supporter video and on Wednesday for everybody else. Take care, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.